Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is week 23, Samurai in Space.
Space. It's actually not that echoey in space, but, dramatic effect, dramatic license.
In space, no one can hear you unsheath your katana.
That's right. So this week we are going to be talking about maybe one of the most famous film connections in history, Star Wars and the Hidden Fortress.
Yeah, so this is our wrap-up to our Samurai series. We have done now 3 episodes of comparing Western adaptations of Akira Kurosawa films. And heretofore, we have discussed literal Western movies that were adapted from Akira Kurosawa films. But in this one, we decided to have some fun with it and just take it into the West, into America, and Star Wars, which is probably more influenced than adapted from The Hidden Fortress, which we'll talk about. But it is a very influential, very well-known connection, and actually one that works a little bit backwards in the way that it gave Hidden Fortress a little bit more attention after the connection to Star Wars was found. But do you just want to give us a quick overview of our 2 movies, Alex?
You know I do, Jonathan. You know I do. Okay, so The Hidden Fortress came out in 1958, and it was directed by the great Akira Kurosawa, who we've talked about many times before on this podcast. And it came out after such hits as Rashomon and Seven Samurai, but before his later, more Western adaptations like Yojimbo. And then, of course, Star Wars from 1977, directed by George Lucas. Worked on by many, many wonderful artists, and maybe one of the most famous films in history, if not the most famous film in history. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of, I think it's maybe a common misconception. It might not be. I might be underestimating the public at large here. But a lot of people think that this was George Lucas's first breakout film. It wasn't. He did have a big hit with American Graffiti, which is a nostalgic coming of age story about growing up in the 40s and 50s like George Lucas did. And that kind of has lost a lot of its luster over the years as, the legacy of Star Wars has dwarfed it. But it was what gave him the street cred in the industry to tackle such a big film like Star Wars.
Right. And, even though American Graffiti is a really good film, it's at this point kind of any breakout or anything kind of pales in comparison to the amount of attention that Star Wars got. I don't think there will ever be a film that just kind of breaks through cultural barriers and seeps into the culture of the entire world as much as Star Wars will. And we can also tie a little bit of this. I mean, just bringing back to Pixar even helped create this with their computer, which we talked about in our Toy Story episode. So a lot of work went into it, and it has been causing ripples in art and pop culture for as long as it's been around.
Yeah, the lasting effects of Star Wars could really be taken up by its own individual podcast. When you're talking about its influence on the way we tell
And I'm sure there are several podcasts.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure there's a few out there already. I just don't know them. But please tweet at us if you know a good one. I would like to listen to that because it sounds fascinating. We're talking about a movie that influenced the way we tell stories, the way we advertise stories in films, the way we create them, on the post-production side, visual effects that created it created industrial light and magic. Which helped pioneer special effects. And like you were saying, back to that Pixar tie-in, helped bring Pixar around, set it on the path to become what it is and what it was, and create animated films the way we know them today.
Right, but it is not a completely original film. Actually, it might be less original than a lot of people think. So let's get into The Hidden Fortress and talk about one of the major influences of this iconic story.
Right. So The Hidden Fortress, Kurosawa's film from 1958, covers the story of feudal Japan in the midst of a lot of civil wars, and there's a lot of larger politicking in the background of this film, but much like in Star Wars, you don't really care so much what that is. All you need to know is that one side is the good guys and one side is the bad guys, and that's what we experience in The Hidden Fortress. But the entire story isn't really told from that point of view. It's told from the point of view of two bumbling peasants who went off to war and lost everything they had, and they keep getting mistaken for being on the wrong side of the fight, and they keep getting captured as prisoners by one side or another. But eventually, they stumble upon some gold, and they stumble upon the owner of that gold, a general in disguise as a thug, played by Toshiro Mifune, who is the last remaining general of the defeated clan. You can go ahead and think of them as the rebellion if you want to, if that helps.
Start those connections already.
You're not inaccurate. It's totally accurate. They're the small side, and it's just this general and the princess and a few retainers hiding out in the mountains. And the general ropes these two peasants into working for him and helping them dig ditches to protect the camp and carrying gold for them. And eventually they set off on a journey to go get help and restore their defeated clan, the quote-unquote rebel clan, to power and to find help among allies. And that's and then they go on that venture. There's a series of events that will sound shockingly familiar when we cover them in detail. Even more so if you read that Star Wars treatment, which you should.
We'll get into that. And
eventually, the two peasants end up reluctantly, more or less, consider it kind of Han Solo-esque reluctance, helping save the day. And there's even a very familiar looking award ceremony where they are given some money by the princess and the general at the very end. So as you can see from what I just told you, and what you'll definitely see if you watch the movie, there's a lot of similarities between The Hidden Fortress and Star Wars. And we'll post a clip this week of George Lucas talking about this, but he was definitely influenced by Kurosawa and The Hidden Fortress in particular. And it's really interesting to take a look at those similarities. It's almost like a fun scavenger hunt watching the movie and being like, oh yeah, that's in Star Wars, or yeah, they have that similar character in Star Wars. And it makes the movie almost a little more interactive at this point, which is just a side effect of how the culture and society evolved. But it's still a fascinating movie, and it's Kurosawa, so it's a very good movie to begin with.
Yeah, and so we'll just kind of talk about it as its own film for a little bit, and I'm going to try to talk about it independently, but point out things that will be important for the Star Wars conversation, because that's kind of what's driving this week. But kind of some unique character interactions that happen in the film are the princess is probably the big one. She's a very strong female character, which is kind of unique for those kind of feudal era films and stuff. And we got a little bit of a strong character in Rashomon with the wife. She had her moments, but her role kind of changed throughout depending on who was telling the story. But the princess is consistently very strong-willed, very opinionated. In fact, she's actually told by the general when they're trying to sneak into one of the enemy territories that she has to act as a mute, because there's no way she could hide her status and her command. If she were to speak, she couldn't contain that, which is very interesting. And then we have the strong general character in Toshiro Mifune and the two bickering little peasants, which almost play off like Shakespearean comic relief characters. In fact, the way that the movie opens reminded me almost of a stage play. We have the two peasants enter and they're bickering and fighting about, morality and if they should have joined the war or whatever. They were just trying to profit from the war. And then this soldier comes in who's been very badly wounded and he dies. He gets stabbed a lot of times by some other soldiers. And then they argue whether they should steal his money or not, and they part ways, which is important for later. And then they find each other again. But those two characters, like just the way that they enter the screen and kind of present the exposition through dialogue, could have been played out the same way in any kind of stage situation. And maybe someday, in a while from now, we'll get into really deeper the Shakespearean influences on Akira Kurosawa. But this was one of the more blatant ones that I think we've looked at so far.
Certainly. And he did a few straight Shakespearean adaptations, if you look at something like The Throne of Blood. But you're right. And that kind of goes back to definitely the theme today, and what's kind of slowly but surely become the theme of the podcast as a whole is art influencing art, influencing art, influencing art, which is always a fun thing to watch for and a fun thing to experience as just an audience member who is in the know and knows to watch for those things with something like Hidden Fortress. But if you are an aspiring filmmaker, like we happen to be, then it can be a great lesson. And that's one of the reasons why we value films like Kurosawa's films and The Hidden Fortress so much, is because it's not only a class in how to make really good movies, but how to learn from other art and take that stuff and make it into really good movies. It's like a tutorial of not just like of filmmaking, but how to steal like an artist.
Right. And how to take elements, not even taking a whole story, but just taking little elements from a variety of sources, because that's how you make something that appears original. You know, the term original is kind of, kind of subjective, because there's nothing new under the sun. You know, anything that we experience is going to influence whatever we create. So there's always going to be those things where you can trace back anything that looks original back to an origin point or several origin points. And the more origin points there are, the more original a piece will seem. And that's a lot of what we're talking about today.
Right. There's a really great quote out there, and I wish I knew who it was from, and I wish I could do more than paraphrase it. But it essentially went along the lines of, if you think that you made something original, you just don't know who you're copying. And I think that's super true. And that's one of the reasons why you should educate yourself if you want to be a creator. But anyway, back to The Hidden Fortress. It wouldn't be a Kurosawa movie, and it wouldn't be a Kurosawa movie on the Filmings podcast if we didn't gush at least a little bit about the cinematography. And the fact that this is the first widescreen movie from Kurosawa, and he takes full advantage of that, and he takes full advantage of the wide array of landscapes that they're on to make characters seem either really powerful, shooting them up high on a mountain. There's that famous shot of Toshiro Mifune as the general with his arms crossed standing on top of the mountain. And then that's
the first thing we see of him. Yeah, it's great because the hills kind of form a V with him at the center, so it focuses all your attention on him. It's just perfect framing, as we've come to expect from Kurosawa film.
Yeah. And we see a very similar shot at least one other time in the film from with a different subject. You see the princess in a very similar stance, except she's got her arms out to the side, I believe, with her switch. It's like a tree branch that you use to hit people.
Or riding crop or something.
Her riding crop, something like that. But she's standing up and she looks super powerful up there, which communicates basically everything you need to know about that character as an introduction right away. And then later on...
But that's also a great shot because it's a contrast. It's a very powerful stance, but it's a very vulnerable moment that we're seeing her in.
Right.
Which kind of, again, like you were saying, sums up her character. She is very strong. She's a great leader, but she has, she's not cold. She's very relatable and human.
Yeah, she cares about the people who she's supposed to lead, and she doesn't want them to suffer for her sake and so on. And that's a big theme within the film itself, and a big character arc that really adds
relates
to it.
to another princess.
Yeah, hint, wink, wink, Star Wars. Yeah, if only she had cinnamon bun hair. But
I'm glad that we don't see that here.
that would have been hilarious, actually. Although I do have a general question, both for you and for the audience, if anybody can help me out here, because I was not able to find anything about it. But were shorts a thing in feudal Japan? I get why she's not wearing a dress. I get like that, but I thought she would be wearing like riding pants and not like shorts, like 20th century shorts. I don't know what that was about, or if that was just like a unique costume decision. And it's not a big deal. It's just a thing, a production choice that fascinates me, and I'm very curious about it. So if anybody knows anything about feudal Japanese shorts, let me know.
No, Tweet it's me. A good question. I was actually noticing the costumes more than I have before in this film, because I mean, I guess as far as female characters in other feudal Kurosawa films that we've seen, female characters are usually wearing kind of a geisha getup or like long robes or whatever. So yeah, this was interesting. I don't know if riding pants are a little too European, so I don't know how that evolved on the Japanese side of things. But also the fact that Toshiro Mifune had this weird, very short shorts, and
very short shorts.
Yeah, and the little like the cropped off sleeves,
just a little too short.
Which was interesting because we haven't seen him in that kind of a getup in his other samurai roles. So the costume was it was just different. I don't know, like we're not like very well versed Japanese historians. So if anyone has information on classic Japanese attire, we are more than interested.
Although I will say, I had a very similar thought about Mifune's getup. Except for the fact that we see his butt almost all the time in Seven Samurai.
Well, that's true. But he was crazy in that one.
That's true. He was supposed to be kind of like a crazy rabid animal, like a stray dog or something. But in this one, he's supposed to be a composed general. I don't know. It's a fascinating thing. I just don't have an answer for it. And if someone does have an answer for it, please let us know.
I'm sure we were only distracted of it out of our ignorance. There's got to be an explanation.
Yeah. I'm just not familiar with the history of pants as well as I should be, and I should resolve that issue soon. And perhaps one of the most interesting things to consider about the Hidden Fortress is its popularity and its reception before Star Wars. Because before Star Wars, when it originally came out, like 20 plus years before Star Wars released in theaters, it was well received. It made some money, but it wasn't the same kind of critical hit that Kurosawa had with Throne of Blood or Rashomon or Seven Samurai. And it was before later hits like The Bad Sleep Well and Yojimbo and Sanjuro. So for Kurosawa and for his career, it didn't do a whole heck of a lot. It was just another solid Kurosawa film, which, believe us, is miles ahead of any other person's solid film. But it didn't have the same kind of notoriety that his other critical hits had achieved until Star Wars came along.
Right. And so after Star Wars is released, kind of instant explosion on the Western culture. And once people started digging into that film, they realized, oh, hey, there are a lot of elements lifted from the Hidden Fortress. So then it's almost this backwards use of attention where, the film that it was influenced got more attention for the original film, which is kind of interesting as far as the films that we've watched, because I feel like the other ones were, the Akira Kurosawa film was heavily, analyzed and looked at and everything, and then it's only natural that some kind of adaptation might come from that. Whereas in this one is, okay, it's there, it's interesting, but then, oh, it influenced Star Wars? Well, let's go check that out.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that Lucas would resort to a deep cut Kurosawa film to inspire one of his movies, but it was probably the right fit. And if you're going to pick a Kurosawa film to be inspired by and not be dwarfed by its legacy, The Hidden Fortress was a good choice. But we should talk about the film that The Hidden Fortress inspired and the film that is maybe the most popular film of all time, Star Wars.
As if Star Wars needed any kind of explanation, but we will give a brief one here. Star Wars is the story of young Luke Skywalker, a farm boy essentially on this alien planet in a galaxy far, far away, a long, long time ago. And he gets caught up in this big intergalactic rebellion against an imperial state with a massive weapon called the Death Star, which can destroy entire planets. And Luke Skywalker comes into possession of these two droids, which bicker and fight a lot, and finds a message in one of their memory circuits from a princess that he gets connected with. He finds an old Jedi Master who is a Jedi is basically a fighter who uses a sword made out of light. And they go off on this quest, and they have to fight this Dark Lord who also has this light sword. And at the end, they save the day, and there's an award ceremony. And they go off onto other adventures, which are never ending, thanks to Disney.
Yeah, so when you were talking about Jedi, I realized that Jedi are literally just space samurai.
The term comes from Jidaigeki, which is the time period that samurai films are set in. That's the Japanese term. So it's literally a one-to-one with Jedi and Jidaigeki.
Very intentional. And also, Jonathan, did you know that originally George Lucas wanted Toshiro Mifune himself to play Obi-Wan Kenobi?
Yes, I did. You can find that morsel of information in the Mifune documentary, which we will plug again this week. You can find that on Netflix. That would have been kind of the most perfect cameo that I can even think of.
Yeah. I love Alec Guinness, but I also love Toshiro Mifune, so I'm torn about it. But needless to say that the movie that was released in 1977 is a classic. And just once again, I want to clarify that we are trying to talk about the despecialized version, the original theatrical release, not that other one that shall not be mentioned. Because that was the one that was released. That was the one that was popular. So that's the one that we're going to try to talk about.
Which doesn't make a huge difference as far as our conversation today, but it's just more fun unless you enjoy terribly animated clutter. Yeah,
and I'm sure those Star Wars podcasts that we mentioned before, as I'm sure it existed. I'm sure there's plenty of those that you can find that will sympathize with your rage about it for an hour at a time. But we are here to talk about The Hidden Fortress and Star Wars, and so we shall. And I feel like the missing link between those two films, because they're already pretty strongly connected. If you watch them together, it's pretty obvious that they're connected. But the real missing link is the original Star Wars treatment, or at least the earliest version of the Star Wars treatment that I could find from George Lucas. And if you don't know what a treatment is what comes of a screenplay before the screenplay itself. So before you write the script, you write a treatment, which is like a 10 to 15 page document that just kind of summarizes, it acts like a synopsis of what the story is going to be.
It's kind of the step between an outline and the script. It's a more prose version, almost a narrative version of the script of the story, start to finish, before you turn it into script form and add specific dialogue and stuff like that.
Exactly. And if you read this treatment for Star Wars, which we will post, it reads so closely to the plot of Hidden Fortress. I
was actually surprised. I'd skimmed it before, but reading it again this week, yeah, it's really scary, similar.
Yeah, it's almost one for one. It's just like the Hidden Fortress set in space. Like there's two bumbling bureaucrats, which are the connection between the two bumbling idiots in the Hidden Fortress, and then the two droids in Star Wars, the final version of Star Wars. And there's the general from the Hidden Fortress is Luke Skywalker, who would
And
eventually
also
be
kind
broken
of
down into several
Obi-Wan.
characters. Also kind of Obi-Wan. And the princess in Star Wars is a fusion of the eventual versions of Luke and Leia, but she's also inspired by the princess in the Hidden Fortress. So it's kind of interesting, before we get too deep into the list, to see this treatment act as kind of a translator between the Hidden Fortress and Star Wars. And it's really fascinating if you take the time to watch the Hidden Fortress, watch Star Wars, and then read the treatment. It's almost like this Rosetta Stone kind of being like, oh, so this is what this means in the Hidden Fortress language, and this is what it means in Star Wars language. And you can see it kind of grow. And how those thoughts came across. And of course, Star Wars was influenced by a lot of other things, and we'll talk about those. But the main plot is just so close to the Hidden Fortress, and you could see that process that went through Lucas's mind to create the eventual Star Wars that came from the Hidden Fortress.
Yeah, and he claims in the little interview that we'll include that the princess was probably not influence from the Hidden Fortress, and mostly just the droids, but there's no way that's true. The princess had to have come from the Hidden Fortress.
There's no way. And also, I feel like we've learned not to believe George Lucas when he talks in interviews, but
we won't get into that.
One
thing I do want to mention, though, about the treatment, which if we haven't mentioned, we'll include in our notes for you to download, is this thing where the bureaucrats are searching for this Aurora spice. This is a big thing in the treatment where they're trying to search for this Aurora spice, and the princess is traveling with some of her clan with a big hoard of Aurora spice, and that is a huge connection to the Hidden Fortress, which is almost completely disappeared. Actually, it is completely disappeared in the final version of Star Wars, but in the Hidden Fortress, when the peasants find the gold and then they find the princess and the general have this big hoard of gold that they have to sneak through enemy territory, and that's pretty much the driving force of the movie. And so when you add that into Star Wars, you see, oh man, yeah, that's the entire ground of the plot of Hidden Fortress brought into Star Wars, and it's a MacGuffin like we talked about back in King Kong with the oil. So this one's actually kind of understandable because it's currency. Currency is typically a pretty effective MacGuffin because we can relate to it on some level. But I think that Star Wars, once George Lucas started getting input and went in a different direction, was able to get to maybe a more effective driving force, no pun intended, than just some kind of monetary or trading goods kind of MacGuffin.
Right. It kind of grew into this narrative about good versus evil, which, if you look back at something like early Hollywood Westerns, which influenced Kurosawa heavily, were also about good versus evil. So again, you kind of see that big loop of art influencing art, of that good versus evil that percolates through to Kurosawa's work, percolating through to Star Wars, and then becoming eventually a key factor in Star Wars of being, the Force, the light side versus the dark side.
And aside from character similarities, there are also several plot similarities that carry over. We lose the MacGuffin element, like I was just talking about, but we do have things like the fact that after the general and the princess and the two peasants leave the Hidden Fortress as they look back, they find that their enemies have found the Hidden Fortress and burned it down, and we just see billowing smoke coming as kind of a very somber moment, and then they move forward knowing that they have nowhere to go back to. And we can see that paralleled twice in Star Wars. We first have the burning of Luke's home, where his uncle and aunt live, and so that's kind of one of the impetuses for him to go on this journey because he has nothing left. And the second way that we see that is when Alderaan is destroyed and Princess Leia's home is completely and totally obliterated, just like the princess in the Hidden Fortress. And she has that moment of kind of standing on top of this mountain and contemplating what this means for her as a leader and all these kind of things. So we can see that was another big one that I was seeing between the Hidden Fortress and Star Wars.
Yeah, and there's also an epic battle between the wise old warrior on the good guy's side in the Hidden Fortress, Kurosawa, and the big bad guy on the other side, which is kind of a general who is eventually turned to the light side. Hint, hint, wink, wink. in Hidden Fortress at the very end, with a scar on his face. In the Hidden Fortress, which obviously translates to Star Wars. And then, you can also see how other Kurosawa films influenced Star Wars. If we talk about something like Yojimbo, which very close to the beginning of the film, there's a big fight and one of the bad guys' arms gets cut off, which we've all know all of the Freudian analysis that's been done on arms being cut off in Star Wars. So there's a lot of influence, and once you start finding them, you just keep finding them and keep finding them.
Right, and we can even see the Kurosawa influence from, even if we just stick to the Hidden Fortress, on the other Star Wars films, such as, there's a horse race in the Hidden Fortress where two horses are riding next to each other, and Toshiro Mifune is having to bump his horse up against one of the bad guys and push him off and all this stuff. And it resembles the speeder race in The Empire Strikes Back. And then there's another point, which might be a little looser, but I don't think we can throw anything out. But the point where the general, the princess, and another woman that they've kind of roped into their ragtag team are all tied up to posts after they've been captured, in a shot that is kind of reminiscent of the arena fight in Attack of the Clones.
Dare we mention the prequels?
Yeah, but I mean, I think that it's still a fair comparison, regardless of what your what your feelings are about the second series of Star Wars films.
Very true. Very true. And we might be wrong, and it might be one of those things that got buried deep in George Lucas's brain somewhere, and he doesn't know about it when he eventually writes it and creates that scene. But I also think that's how a lot of these things end up happening. That's how a lot of these shots that get copied end up happening, is that they're not consciously taken. It's just something you've seen before, and you end up incorporating it back into your work.
Absolutely. And these are not all, we're just kind of scratching the surface on some of these comparisons. We'll include links to comparisons with Star Wars and Kurosawa films. But Star Wars is, like we're talking about with pulling from different influences, Star Wars is an amalgam of influences. It pulls from World War II footage with the space fighting scenes, which is why, you can't really argue about the physics of the space fights, is because it's more parody than anything of, World War II footage and old war movies. And then also serials like Flash Gordon and classic Hollywood swashbuckling and stuff like that.
Yeah, originally Lucas wanted to make a Flash Gordon remake, but he ended up making Star Wars instead.
Yeah, you can see the title crawl for Star Wars can be almost directly pulled from the old Flash Gordon, and also soft wipes, which we see in old serials and also pretty much every Akira Kurosawa film.
Yeah, Yeah, soft wipes everywhere. And we should also mention that we're not talking about like a really old box of Apple Jacks or anything. Cereal spelled Serial, and those are really really old Hollywood conventions that were these little short films, eventually turned into TV shows and so on. And you can even see their influence in YouTube channels today. But they're just a series of adventures that never really ended. It would just continued from week to week to week to week. So if you're talking about like Flash Gordon, you'd see somebody, Flash Gordon, go on an adventure one week that was like 30 minutes long, and then go on another adventure the next week. And it wasn't really about big storytelling, but it was these little fun package adventures that influenced a lot of the work of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, like we talked about way back in our first episode, starting with Spielberg.
And since we picked up a lot of listeners since then, if you want to go back to the back catalog, it's available for you. But now that you kind of put it like that, as far as serials and stuff, it's almost interesting to think about what Star Wars has become, in the way that it has become a never-ending series of adventures that for the foreseeable future will not end, and we'll have a new one every year, every 2 years, with little pieces thrown in between. So it's almost a foreshadowing, almost a large-scale serial. I saw an article one time, and the headline was, "You will never live long enough to see the last Star Wars film." And I think that pretty much sums it up.
That's probably pretty true. I think they're booked solid for what, like the next 10 years or something already?
Too much.
But yeah, buckle yourselves in. I hope you like Star Wars, and I hope you like the new Disney Star Wars, because there's going to be a lot of it. But with that, let's slide into our overall notes, and let's talk about exactly that. Why is Star Wars so much more successful than The Hidden Fortress? Why has it had all this success, but The Hidden Fortress is kind of only known in reference to Star Wars?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of factors, and I don't think that we can come up with a, definitive answer. But I think one of the factors that at least plays a part is where each of these films was released. Star Wars is a major Hollywood production. It has top of the line computer graphics and stuff like that, and just had the potential to reach way more people than Akira Kurosawa did. Even though Akira Kurosawa already had a pretty well-established Western audience, it would never be the same as a mainstream movie-going American audience would at just any movie theater, because you would kind of have to go search out an Akira Kurosawa film, whereas Star Wars was playing everywhere, and it was just able to spread so much faster. And I don't think that's the only thing, but I think that is probably a big part.
Oh, for sure, certainly. And the 70s, that time period in Hollywood, was a time where the way movies were marketed was being revolutionized. There were big nationwide pushes for these big blockbuster films right before they came out. So something like Jaws, something like Star Wars had already been amped up and hyped up before it even came out. And then afterwards, how should I put this? Well, let me say this. If you go to Walmart and you go to the toy section, you are going to find a toy Ewok, you're going to find a toy Chewbacca, you're going to find a toy Obi-Wan Kenobi, but you are not going to find a toy Toshiro Mifune as a samurai. You are not going to find the two bumbling idiots as action figures. You are going to find C-3PO and R2-D2, and then you're going to go to Disney and you're going to go to the new Star Wars land that'll come out in the next few years. And you'll turn on your TV and you'll see Star Wars ads and Star Wars merchandise and just endless Star Wars, which, if you like Star Wars, is fantastic. But the point is, it was a movie that sparked the imagination of the public, entered the pop culture, entered the mainstream, and then never left. It was hyped up from the since before its release, and it never stopped. It's still going for this day. And like you said before, we're probably gonna die before the last Star Wars film comes out, which might be with the end of humanity, whenever that is. So the chances of it the hype ever stopping is super low, especially now that they're with Disney, which hypes everything. So
Right.
we're always going to see it. And whereas Kurosawa films, you can go find them on the Criterion Collection, which is, that's for film fanatics, for cinephiles, for people who like indie films and classic films and hard to find films, people like us. And we like Star Wars, but we also like that deep cut stuff. And it kind of lives in that niche market. And the only time it kind of enters that pop culture, that mainstream, is when it's in reference to Star Wars, like we're doing today. And that's one of the reasons that I like doing this episode, is because I like Star Wars, but I also really like Kurosawa. And if I can leverage the popularity of Star Wars to help introduce somebody to Kurosawa, I will. Because I think people will like Kurosawa's films if they give them a chance. But like I said, you're not going to find a Toshiro Mifune action figure in the toy aisle at Walmart.
Right. And I think one other factor that we might talk about is the fact that I think we both had the impression that The Hidden Fortress is probably not our favorite of Akira Kurosawa's film. It's a masterpiece, and it's like what many other directors would dream of, creating a film like The Hidden Fortress. But compared to some of the other behemoths that Akira Kurosawa created, it's not necessarily at the top of the list. So I wonder if, because The Hidden Fortress is being put up against, the greatest of the great films, and it doesn't totally hit the top mark, it didn't get as much attention as some of his other films, like Seven Samurai have, which is just something kind of interesting to think about. I don't know.
It's kind of fallen victim to his own success.
Right.
Is that all of his films are so good, but still only the creme de la creme of the creme de la creme has been remembered. So
and even George Lucas says that in that interview, that it's not his favorite of the Kurosawa films that he had, but it's still kind of those elements that we talked about stuck with him, and he incorporated them.
Yeah, and it was a great palette to build a sci-fi epic off of. Apparently, it worked. So,
and like you were saying, if you want to introduce someone to Kurosawa, it's a great place to start because you have somewhere to move up from there.
Right. And then you go and watch something like The Bad Sleep Well or Seven Samurai or Yojimbo, and you're like, hey, I like this. Hopefully, I think you will, because they are really good films. Really, this whole episode is an excuse for me to try to get you hooked on Kurosawa, but,
As if we haven't already with our last 3 Kurosawa episodes.
Maybe. That might have been my entire excuse for this podcast, but you'll never know.
But let's go ahead and kind of talk about the difference between adaptation and inspiration, because that's one of the differences with this week than our other 3 Kurosawa weeks, is the fact that Star Wars is not a direct adaptation like our others were. The others were almost complete adaptation from the story. Each of the plot beats follows through the end. But this one, we're just like finding elements and finding little traces of it, as opposed to following each plot beat and seeing what's different or how the setting influences it.
Right. And I think that comes from this fusion of Lucas and the other people who worked on this film, like Kasdan, taking not just...
That's Lawrence Kasdan, the writer.
Right. Not just taking Kurosawa or even just The Hidden Fortress as inspiration, but taking a lot of other things as inspiration, like Flash Gordon, like the World War II films, and putting them together to make something new, and then building off those ideas and tweaking it until you get Star Wars. And now I think if they had just stopped at this original treatment and made that, I would have called it an adaptation. In a heartbeat, I would have called it an adaptation. But Star Wars, as it lives now, took it and they went that extra step, that extra 39 steps, and brought out something that feels original because it's all those influences and worked to that final point where you have something that is inspired by but not a copy of other people's work.
Right. And we have a video that we'll include in the blog post today. We have a lot of resources today.
Right. Shocker. There's a lot of resources on Star Wars, guys. Who would have thought?
What? But it's a series called Everything is a Remix, which kind of goes into all this that we're talking about. And I'll include the episode that covers Star Wars and a lot of the things that go into it. But one of the bigger questions of that series is why are we excited about some things as an adaptation, but why do we look down on other things that pull influence and yell copying? They just copied at them. And we need to kind of get to a place where we're okay with this quote unquote copying, because without copying, there is no good art. All good art has to come from this established history of art that we have from every medium. And that's one of the great things about film, is that you can literally draw from every medium because it incorporates every type of art into one film.
Right. And the other side of that is learning to copy as inspiration and not just copying. And like we talked about back in the Samurai and Sombreros episode, with A Fistful of Dollars and Yojimbo, where...
That's the second one, for anyone following along.
Right. Where the director of A Fistful of Dollars actually got sued by Toho Studios for his uncredited adaptation of Yojimbo. There's an interesting line, both legally, morally, ethically, creatively. At what point are you just adapting and copying, and at what point is it its own thing? Where is that line? Where is that breakaway? And it's something that's hard to define, because if you look at Star Wars and you look at Hidden Fortress, I think you're not looking at an adaptation, you're looking at inspiration. And like I said before, if they had stopped at the original treatment and done a story along those lines, I think you would have been at the point of adaptation. But what is the definable difference between something like Star Wars that we call inspired and something like A Fistful of Dollars, which we call an adaptation?
Yeah, and I think, like I kind of mentioned before, there's the amount of things that you're pulling from helps with that. It helps to kind of dissipate the direct connection to any one piece and just see it as, an amalgam of other pieces. And another thing that kind of plays into this element of, when do you need to give credit versus when is it just something that inspired you is, how recently the work was created. So, for example, some of the Kurosawa films that are drawing from Shakespeare or directly adapting Shakespeare is, completely fair game. We have our copyright
within the public domain.
Right. We have our copyright fair use laws and stuff, and that may be different across cultures, but there are, myths and legends and things that are so old and so pervasive that there's no worry of, copying, or this idea that copying it is a negative thing. So if you adapt the Odyssey into the Old South, like the Coen brothers did with O Brother, Where Art Thou, you have full rights to do that because it's such a kind of just historically ingrained story. And similar thing with Tolkien's entire mythos was pulled from a million different cultures, a million different stories and tales and myths and legends, and all these things come together. And the more you draw from and just warp a little bit, the more you come to that place that is quote unquote original and completely yours, because the person who's creating it is up to that point the only person who has taken all of those influences and combined them in just that way. And that is where we get originality. It's almost, if you want to break it down to a really basic level, every book that's ever been written in the English language was written with the same 26 letters, but those 26 letters had never been combined in exactly the same way as a certain author can do it, and so that's what makes it unique. Pulling from the same letter bank or art bank and putting them together in a very unique way.
Right. And I don't think there's anything wrong with looking for inspiration or even specific traits or tricks or motifs or themes or characters or whatever that you want to take from another person's piece of work. I think it's completely natural, in fact. But there is that distinction between being inspired, being influenced, and taking a lot of different things to make your new thing, and just ripping someone off. And I think that's why we have that legal distinction. And it's important. It's an important thing to keep an eye on, especially in a time period like today, where so much work is being released online, and it's
so much content. Yeah,
so much content. It's so easy to step on somebody else's toes, or to try to get away with it, or be caught, or so on and so forth. And I think the best solution to that is just to do your work, do the groundwork, do the drudgery of or I don't want to call it drudgery. Drudgery sounds bad. I just want to emphasize that it's hard work, but it is enjoyable work to learn all these references and to learn how. I feel like we just keep going back to that title of that one book, How to Steal Like an Artist, but it's such a good term. And so many famous artists, especially so many filmmakers, have talked about how to steal like an artist, how to take this thing from there, how to take that thing from that film, this type of color palette from that painting, and combine it together to make it something that feels original and new. And it's a pretty incredible thing to watch.
Yeah, and the more art that you consume, the more knowledge you have of where to skirt the lines, where to know as you're creating when you're coming too close to one work and too close to another work, and you can kind of start to warp them in a very personal way. And I think that's a big part of it, is personalization. You take the inspiration and then you personalize it. You infuse your own worldview and your own personal experiences into it, and then it comes out as something different and hopefully unrecognizable or not directly ripping off someone else. And that goes back to the fact that the fewer inspirations you have, the easier it is to be called out as ripping off or something, or the more obligation you have to say, hey guys, we took this story like The Magnificent Seven did, where in the opening credits it says adapted from The Seven Samurai. So at that point they're acknowledging it. They know that this story came straight from Akira Kurosawa, and we loved it so much that we wanted to put it in a more close to home kind of environment.
Right. You kind of got to know, you've got to know what the rules are and where the lines are before you can break the rules and cross the lines. Which is interesting. And I'm sure many lawyers will have good times as we move into this hyper-saturated, content-filled digital world that we are now in. But it is an interesting thing to look at both in the past as you study art on your own, and in the present as you try to make art on your own.
And, in terms of getting a broad spectrum of knowledge of art and art from different cultures, that will bring us into the summer. And we have a very exciting announcement for the podcast. Alex, would you do the honors?
That's right, Jonathan. We've been planning it for a while. The Filmlings is going global with the Filmlings World Tour. World Tour. World Tour. World Tour. We're going global to go country to country this summer. 10 different weeks as we explore cinema from around the globe.
Yeah, so each week we're going to pick a different country, ones that have had influential films in terms of film history, or just influential films in terms of modern film. And we're going to pick 3 movies. I think they're all from different directors. We have different directors for each week.
We do have different directors for each week, Jonathan.
Thank you, announcer Alex.
You're welcome.
And we have 10 weeks lined up for you guys, and we've spent a lot of time in Japan, specifically with Akira Kurosawa, and we've been asked by multiple people, what other countries have influenced cinema? And we are going to find out, and we're going all over the world to see what films have been made and what their influence on our movie-going experience is. So what's up first, Alex?
That's right, Jonathan. Next week, for the first week of the world tour, we're going to Italy for a little look at Italian neorealism. Our first film for the week will be Rome, Open City from 1945. Our second film of the week will be Bicycle Thieves from 1948. And our final film of the week will be 8.5 from 1963.
Yep. We are very excited. Italian neorealism was one specific kind of wave of cinema that went through Italy. And we'll look at a couple other waves of cinema that went across Europe and other parts of the world. And right now, on our Twitter account, at the Filmlings on Twitter, we are running a poll with 4 different countries. And you guys will get to pick which country we go to second. And we're just going to take off running from there.
That's right. I'm excited. I hope you are too.
Absolutely.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.wordpress.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, see ya. Wow, I was a little bit spaced out there.
Spaced out. Someone's funny this week.